Well, welcome back to the Faith Roots podcast, and we're continuing our Jesus and the Gospel series. And today we are looking at the birth narratives, the accounts that tell us about when Jesus was born. Remember that as we are looking at Jesus in the Gospels, we are trying to get a sense of what all of the Gospels do, but we're focusing particularly on Luke's account. What I'd encourage you to do at this stage is specifically to read Luke chapter 2. You might also want to pay a bit of attention to Matthew chapter 1 and Matthew chapter 2, because what you will notice if you look at the beginning of all four Gospels is that it is only Matthew and Luke that tell us about Jesus' birth in any kind of detail. Mark launches straight in at Jesus's ministry, begins with Jesus' baptism. John also goes there in terms of the narrative. He begins with a prologue that talks about Jesus using the title the Word, or Logos, to describe Jesus as the revelation of God, the one who reveals who God is, what God is like, the very image of God, the way in which God speaks. And John 1 says that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. A couple of very crucial and important things there, that John is telling us that Jesus is divine. The Word was God. He's also introducing us to the concept of the Trinity. The Word was there at the beginning. The Word is eternal, so is not created. In fact, John will tell us that there is nothing that has been created that wasn't created through the Word, through Jesus. But the Word is both God and is with God, there with the Father and the Spirit in eternity. But then John goes on to say, John 1 verse 14, that the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And there he sums up in one short phrase the incarnation, that God came to live amongst us as a man. So that's John and Mark. Matthew and Luke are alone in telling us about the birth accounts. That's caused skeptics to suggest that these were later additions added on to give a bit of backstory to the brief accounts that Mark gives, and the sayings and teachings of Jesus that we find in other source documents. Remember, the theory was that there was this source of Jesus's teachings called Q. Well, I don't think there's any reason to make that presumption. I think simply what we're seeing is that, John has already told us theologically what is happening, so there's no reason to doubt that these are true and historical records, that Matthew and Luke choose to take us a bit further back to give us a bit of the background detail, to tell us a bit more about why and how Jesus came. And they do it in different ways. They pick up on different sources, different eyewitnesses. So Luke seems to rely more on Mary, Matthew on Joseph, and they select specific events to focus in on. Matthew tells us, in terms of the precursors, about the angel Gabriel appearing to Joseph in a dream after Mary's already been visited by Gabriel and has become pregnant, to reassure him, a righteous man who's considering secretly divorcing his wife so that he doesn't shame her, but also so that he is not tinged by any sinful behavior on her part. Well, the angel appears to Joseph to say, no, go through with your marriage. This is not a baby the result of a premarital, extramarital affair. No, God is at work here. You're going to be, in effect, the adoptive father, the stepfather for God's Son come to live amongst us. And Matthew and Luke give us a bit of timing about this. Matthew shows us that this all happened during the reign of King Herod, Herod the Great. He was originally from Edom, so an Idumean, and he had converted to Judaism. But there were some suspicions about whether or not this was genuine, whether this was to ingratiate himself with the people. He'd spent a lot of money on lavish building projects, including extending and beautifying the temple, the second temple. And he had been appointed king by the Roman Senate, so he'd gone to Rome to receive a kingship. This will play its part in the background to some of Jesus' parables later. Luke tells us in Luke chapter 2, verse 1, that it's during the reign of Augustus Caesar. Augustus has declared a census, and that this is at the time that a guy called Quirinius is governor in Syria. Now, Quirinius was the kind of the civil governor, equivalent to Pilate, up in Syria, around about 6 AD. Herod dies in about 4 BC. So a potential timing issue there. And some people have said, is there a contradiction, or does Luke or Matthew get their facts wrong? Well, Quirinius had also had a military role in the government and administration of Syria back more than 10 years previously. So I think, from memory, around about 10 to 7 BC. And around about that time, Augustus had summoned people to register and show their support for him as the emperor. So what is likely is that this is the census that Quirinius is in overseas as a military governor, that Augustus calls. Now, we may be towards the end of that census when it reaches Galilee and Judea, but Quirinius has kicked it off. And that means that Jesus was born probably sometime between 10 and 4 BC. Could have been as late as 4 BC. If Jesus was a couple of years old when the wise men arrived, that would put it back to about 6 BC, I guess, or even earlier, even sort of 7 or 8 BC. So around about that kind of time. And so we've got a time and location for when these events start to happen. Then Luke tells us about some of the key things. First, he tells us that Jesus was born in Bethlehem. So in 2 verse 1 to 7, we're told how Mary and Joseph go to Bethlehem. They go to their home town, to Joseph's ancestral town, really to the family home, in order that they might be registered there. Notice that whilst we have our sort of nativity stories with an inn and an innkeeper and a stable, actually those places and those things are absent from the account here. The word that has become translated, that's been translated as inn, probably referred to an upper or an inner room, the guest room, the best room in the house. Imagine a Palestinian Jewish house back about the time of Jesus. And you should have in your mind one of those sort of big rooms in a single story building with a flat roof, sometimes with an additional room on top. And the room itself would have been on two levels. There would have been a slightly lower level, which is where the animals would be brought into at night. No separate stable. You all lived and mucked in together, literally. And then a sort of a raised platform where the family would sleep. And so Jesus is born probably not in a stable because an innkeeper, the local equivalent of Premier Inn or the local tavern, has turned him away, but because the family have arrived at the family home. And the home is crowded out and there's additional people there. Although you might want to give this pregnant girl the guest room for some privacy, actually that's all taken up, and so the family are just all in together. Jesus is, from that perspective, not the outcast and stranger, but very much at the heart of things, not ignored, not relying on a borrowed room, all those kinds of things that we sing in the carols. Was there room for Jesus? Yes, there was. And it should challenge and encourage us to think about Jesus coming right into the reality and the mess, the joy and the happiness, the struggles and trials of real family life. And that should help us think about what it means for Jesus to be at the heart of our church, the heart of our own lives, the heart of our families, and even to seek for Jesus and the gospel to be at the heart of our wider communities. Then Luke famously tells us about the angel Gabriel announcing the birth to shepherds, and then he's accompanied by this great throng of angels who sing glory to God in the highest, peace on earth to those of goodwill, or those on whom God's favour rests. These shepherds are favoured because they've received the good news. Whilst it's possible that Luke wants us to pick up on their status in society, the more humble, even not so respectable in society, their work with smelly sheep might have left them on the fringes of society. On the converse, the role of a shepherd, the association of shepherds with kings and with David is significant through the Old Testament. Whilst there may be an emphasis on the poor here, actually the primary point is that these men are blessed because God has revealed the good news of the gospel to them. And just as in the same way Jesus will later call fishermen to leave their nets and tax collectors to leave their booths, and insurgents to leave their plotting and military exercises, and all the rest of it, these shepherds are called to leave their work watching their flocks because Jesus and the gospel is of highest importance. And so they turn up in Bethlehem. This is Luke chapter 2, verse 8 to 20. And they glorify God and they praise him and they tell others about Jesus. Their response to seeing Jesus is worship and witness. As the Shorter Catechism says, the chief end, the chief goal of humanity is to glorify God and enjoy him forever. 8 days later, verse 21, Jesus is circumcised. He's named Jesus. So Jesus is fulfilling all of the requirements of the law. And there's a further fulfillment. There's this purification offering that is required, um, and an opportunity to present the baby before the Lord. Verse 22 through to verse 24. This was the point where Mary should be coming out of her seclusion, and offerings are made to declare her clean, not unclean. The baby is dedicated back to the Lord in recognition that the firstborn belongs to the Lord, because the firstborn son was protected when the angel of death passed over in Egypt. Something that's done symbolically in most cases, happened overtly, of course, with Samuel. And whilst they're in Jerusalem, they come into contact with two people, two prophetic people. Simeon, who's been waiting for this moment. God has promised him that he would live to see this day. And he's in the temple, and he prays, he sings, he prophesies, he blesses the baby in his arms, verse 28. And he says, verse 29 to 32, I'm ready to die now. I've seen your salvation. Now, this could suggest that Simeon was an elderly man, probably the most likely, but again, Luke doesn't state that. But the point is this. This is the high point of his life. This is what he is, what he's been waiting for. I notice that Luke wants his Gentile readers to hear these words. The promise is that Jesus is a light to the nations, to the Gentiles, as well as being the glory of God's people, Israel. Mary and Joseph, despite having angelic visits, shepherds visits, wise men visits to come late at some point, probably later, Mary and Joseph are amazed. They're still taking this all in. Simeon says this child is destined to cause many in Israel to fall and many others to rise. That sense of the proud being brought low and the humble lifted up, which of course Mary has sung about. There's another prophet, a prophetess, Anna, and she's there. She sees Jesus. She's 84 years old, or possibly has been a widow for 84 years, which would make her even older still. She has spent her widowhood worshipping, praying, fasting in the temple. She sees Simeon talking with Mary and Joseph, and she knows what is happening because she presumably will have known Simeon and known what he was waiting and looking for. And so she's so excited as she goes, as she tells everyone the baby's been born. Specifically focusing on those, quote, who were expecting God to rescue Jerusalem. Jerusalem there summing up God's land and God's people, the nation of Israel. God has come to rescue his people. Well, Mary and Joseph returned to Galilee. We know from Matthew's account that there's a detour. Wise men come from the east. They see a star. They recognize it as a sign that a king has been born. They go via Jerusalem, where they meet Herod. Herod sends them on to find Jesus. They're guided to Bethlehem, and then they're warned to return a different way. And Mary and Joseph take the baby into exile into Egypt to escape Herod's wrath as he comes seeking to kill the baby. This could have been as late as 2 years later, because Herod has all of the children under 2 years old in Bethlehem killed. That wouldn't have been a great massacre. Just a small town, maybe a dozen or so children would have been affected at most, but brutal for those that were there. It could have been earlier. There's nothing to say that Jesus was 2 years old, so it may have been sooner, but it would have been after that trip to Jerusalem, which would have been risky if Herod was seeking out Jesus. And Mary and Joseph only come back from Egypt, Matthew tells us, when they hear that Herod has died, so around about 4 BC. Matthew says that this is to fulfill a prophetic word in Hosea 11 verse 1, out of Egypt I've called my son, actually a prophecy that talks about Israel coming out of Egypt. Jesus is not just fulfilling sort of random predictions, but he is recapitulating or reliving the history of Israel and of God's people. Jesus has experienced exile in Egypt. Jesus experiences his own exodus. We'll be seeing more of that through the Gospels. And then the Gospel accounts, even Luke, are pretty much silent until Jesus reaches 30 years old, with one exception. In verse 41 to verse 52, we're told about Jesus going with his parents when he's about 12 years old, coming close to his bar mitzvah and Jewish adulthood, and he goes with his parents down to Jerusalem, and they lose him, and they find him in the temple, arguing, debating, reasoning with the religious leaders, who are amazed and astounded at him. And Mary and Joseph say to him, "What are you doing here? We were looking for you. We were worried about you, your mother and father." And Jesus reminds them, "No, my father is God, and I'm here in his house doing his work." And then they return to Nazareth. Although Jesus has challenged and rebuked them, he is obedient as a son to them, fulfilling the righteousness of God's law. And Mary remembers all these things, and Jesus grows, reflecting his humanity, Jesus fully God and fully man, in wisdom and stature and favour with God and all the people. Verse 52. And we see here Jesus fully God, fully man, but we also see how all of the gospel accounts are pointed to Jesus as the hope of God's people, the fulfillment of God's promises, and therefore the one that we should trust in.